My name is Neeraj Bhatia. I'm the founder of an office called The Open Workshop. I'm also an associate professor at the California College of the Arts, where I co-direct a research lab there called the Urban Works Agency, which really looks at urban issues. And I think both in the research lab as well as my office, there's an interest in looking at the range of design skills required to address both the city through the architectural project and think about how the architectural project pushes back on the design of the city. So I'm from Toronto, Canada originally, and I grew up there my whole life until my 20s when I came to the States for the first time. And I really feel connected to Toronto. And I think the reason for that is Toronto is an extremely multicultural place. In fact, growing up there, it's this type of city that has the visible minority is in fact the majority. And I think because of that, it really informed a lot of my own interests in how to deal with pluralism, how to think about how cities become diverse and integrated, and how they balance both people's identities that they come to a place with, as well as understanding how people connect together simultaneously. And that's a really tricky balance to find. How do you have a multicultural place where people are not assimilated into the place, but also retain their own identity, but yet still feel some level of integration as a collective? And Toronto is a really amazing place and a very unique and rare place, I think, for that. So I feel very connected to it as a place. And in fact, that interest in pluralism is one of the things that really drives a lot of my interests in my office right now. There's a lot of people that have that story that they say, you know, from a very young age, I knew I wanted to be an architect, and I definitely didn't have that story. In fact, I came into it pretty late, I went to university for architecture, but I don't think I really came to that realization maybe just until applying for university that this might be something of interest. I had a lot of interest in certain sciences and physical sciences in particular, as well as in the graphic arts, media, and when I came across architecture, it seemed like a great synthesis of these two worlds. And then as I went into architecture, I realized more and more how it was a discipline that integrated a lot of my interests. And moving through college, then finally into a post-professional degree in architecture, my interest started expanding from the building to the city. And I think that, harkens back to a lot of my own upbringing in Toronto. I ended up studying my undergrad at the University of Waterloo, which is about an hour and a half drive from Toronto. And at the time, it really captured me because it was a program that really focused on cultural history as part of the education. So there's a class at Waterloo that they still have to this day called iconography, which is weighted almost equally to design studio. And in that class, you do a lot of reading, almost a book a week. And we were tested on these books, but not tested in a way of understanding, do you comprehend the plot or in that way, but tested in a deep way about how to develop critical thinking against the literature that we were exposed to. And oftentimes these tests we could only answer in 5 sentences, so you were capped. So you had to be very precise with your answer. And it was really a class that helped you both reflect on cultural history and theory, but also be precise with an assessment and how to articulate that assessment. And I think it's something that I've really held on to, that, a lot of my own practice, I would say, both in design teaching, includes writing as a way to work through research and ideas and reflect on the things that we're doing through design. At that time, my interests were much more architectural in scale, and I remember taking a studio with Professor Derek Revington on urban scale issues, and that was the first studio on a bigger scale than the building. And what I loved about that scale was that there seemed to be more agency of what the architectural product can do for more people's lives, and it got into conversations of politics, economics, how do we think about living together in ways that a building can of course do, but was much more overt in the bigger scale. And so when I left Waterloo, I went almost directly to MIT to do a post-professional degree in architecture and urban design. And at MIT worked very closely with Alexander de Hoog, who runs the office Organization for Permanent Modernity, who was a large influence in my research at MIT, looking at more overtly architectural form and its relationship to territorial design. And this is something that I've kept with me throughout my career since then. There is a perceived idea that there's firms that work more on the formal aesthetic ideas of architecture and firms that work more on, say, social issues or ecological issues, cultural issues. And I say perceived because I think that that schism of that you either do this or do that is completely arbitrary. And I think it's something that we as a discipline have invented, that people that work with form and aesthetics don't care about other issues, or people that care about issues don't have the capacity to think through form and aesthetics. And that's always been something for me that I've been interested in both these things. And, and I don't understand why they would be, at odds with each other by any means. I think the way that we understand the world and look around the world is through the things we interact with, and those have physical properties to them and aesthetics, and it often gives a legibility to power, or sometimes suppresses questions about how systems work or how power is disseminated in the landscape. And so my interest has always been to take these two worlds that I don't see as different worlds, but actually to operate at the nexus, and try to understand how can you have an aesthetic in a formal project that doesn't relinquish the architectural disciplinary process in service of, other larger issues, but at the same time, those issues are the reality of our world. And there's maybe a deeper question here about, what type of relevance do we want as a discipline to future issues? When we turn on the news today and you see what's happening worldwide in politics, worldwide with the climate crisis, it is difficult to understand how not to address that as a spatial design discipline, knowing that many of those issues come down to how we interact with space and how we interact with each other through space. So I really want to bridge these two things together, and I hope that for the next generation and future generations that this perceived divide doesn't exist anymore, because I really do think that to address a lot of the social and even ecological issues we have, we need to think through form and aesthetics, because it is a way that people connect with the landscapes, territories around them. Many of the issues we are seeing in the world are becoming increasingly generic. So there are ways to, use your local geography to extract principles to apply to other parts of the world, knowing that economics is one of the largest drivers of how land is being territorialized, and those formats of territorialization are becoming increasingly self-similar. On the other hand, being in a local area, there are nuances. There's neighborhood groups to local cultures that can't always be understood from a distance. So, more recently, I would say a lot of my research has been formatted at two scales. The scale of the territory, which has been a project looking at the Central Valley in California. The Central Valley is sort of the inland valley of California. It's sort of the background of California. It's where a lot of the agriculture happens, where a lot of migrant workers and undocumented workers are. It's where a lot of the oil extraction happens. It's where there's a lot of contestation around water and resources. And for me, it's really the backbone of what allows California to survive. Yet it's not discussed, and it's really exists in the background. And and even the image of California rarely includes the Central Valley. And so I've been looking at that for about the last 3 years and trying to understand, how do we design in these background landscapes where there's such a range of inequalities and so many difficult byproducts of the way we extract resources and think about labor in these territories. The other scale I've been looking at is really the scale of housing, and that's much more to the scale of the private realm, and I would say tied much more to the city, because we know cities are largely made up of housing. And in particular, being here in San Francisco, where we have a massive housing shortage and affordable housing crisis. As you probably know, we don't have enough housing, and it's not accessible to many people, the cost of housing. And this has many different causes, from policy issues to population growth to the difficulty of construction, that are wrapped up into this question of what are we going to do? How do we grow as a city? But also, we are a city that is one of the richest cities in the world with, various entrepreneurism and technological advancement, yet we have a large homeless problem. And this, for me, is kind of showing in some ways the real issues of late capitalism, where you can see most directly the inequalities. And so a lot of this research around housing I've been doing has been looking much more specifically at communes and different forms of co-living. And I'm working on this with a colleague of mine at CCA, Antje Steinmüller. And this project started with us being interested in how do people form their own politics outside of a system? Because housing is often a byproduct of the myth of a system, what a nuclear family is, what the roles of a family should be, develop the spaces around us. And we wanted to question that. And of course, being here in San Francisco, where if we just rewind the clock back 50, 60 years, we had a huge movement of communes and of hippies and of people that were trying to experiment with alternative politics, alternative family types, thinking about how they arrange domestic space in ways that reflect who they are and create meaningful social units that go beyond the nuclear family. And so there's this deep legacy here in San Francisco, and several of these communes have survived, both in the city and outside the city in Northern California. Several more are starting, partly because of necessity, and the cost of living here, partly because of the current politics and wanting to, again, develop systems where people can organize their way of life that sits more precisely in the governance models that they choose. And so this research, there's many aspects to this research, and obviously one of the biggest ones is that people living together actually produces more affordability because we don't have as much redundancy in resource overlap that the nuclear family and the nuclear household has provided. But the other strains of this research is that we also know that the nuclear family is not the majority. It's a minority, and we don't really address that. We still have the myth that the nuclear family is what's driving housing, and yet in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, people are living with roommates, into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and we don't necessarily acknowledge that. And those situations aren't things to be seen as issues to grow out of, or issues to acquire wealth and gain privacy, but in fact, those living conditions have provided really deep, meaningful social bonds between people that I think are things that we can all learn from. I don't know if we as architects have been the best at articulating the value we offer to the world. And I don't mean value as in economic value. I think that's one way to obviously interpret value. But I think there is a perception from, society at large that the value we offer is solely aesthetic in nature. And I think if we are able to articulate more precisely the range of values that go from the qualitative to the quantitative that we are able to offer, and how some of those values can be evaluated at the short time scale. And some of those values actually will be evaluated in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It produces a much more holistic conversation around the discipline's role. And I think that's incumbent on us as architects to articulate. We obviously give visions to the future, right? And that's one of the biggest things we do, is that we draw things that don't exist and we put people in those worlds, and what we articulate in those worlds, in those drawings, somehow become our realities, right? And it allows people to bridge the gap between the present and the future. Yet oftentimes what we are articulating in those worlds reaffirm, issues of today instead of trying to go beyond them or address them. Yeah, I think it's difficult to be an architect anywhere. I will say that. I think so maybe to your first question about the day-to-day, I'm teaching full-time at CCA, and I work with 3 other directors on our research lab, and one of the research projects is the one I just mentioned on communes. And so that is a big part of my life, and something I really cherish, because I think it's something that, not only enriches the discussion in the office and things I'm thinking about, it provides a platform to interface with, in some ways, the future, right? the students that we're both educating are going to be really the ones that have to address a lot of things that we can see percolating on the horizon. And so I really value that, and it is a big investment of my day-to-day. In the office, it's maybe not so different than you. We're working on a couple houses here in the city. We're doing one in Germany. We're currently working on the Venice Biennale, which will open in May. So the Venice project is actually taking up the majority of my time right now in the office, because we have a deadline in a couple months to get everything together and ship it out. And but there's always, I would say, a range of projects in the office, from things like exhibitions that might be more discursive or research based, to real projects, to larger territorial research projects. And I would say research projects in that regard, because this might segue into the second part of your question, is that it is difficult to get commissions for larger scale projects in the States. It's difficult to get commissions as a young architect for almost any project in the States. And this is also why we're starting with houses. I think those are some of the easiest commissions to build capacity, to understand planning policy, and to build legitimacy, to enter into other project types. But getting into the urban scale projects is really difficult as a young firm. So a lot of those projects are more research based, but we hope that, in a matter of years, that slowly those research projects start shifting into real world design projects. So there's always a little bit of all these things going on. I think one of the most difficult parts in the States is getting commissions. I think there's less risk that's being taken on for young architects in the States. America, and I'm saying this coming from Canada, but I would extend this also to Canada. They're litigious societies, so there's a lot of liability that goes into the building process, and there's not only does that make it very difficult to be an architect. In America, you're studying for a series of years, you're working in an office to get certain types of hours, and then you're writing a series of exams that, the threshold to actually stamp a drawing is quite high. And the liability that you assume for stamping that drawing is very high. And that's from the architect's point of view. From the other side, from a client's point of view, I think there's less risk-taking on not just the architectural form, but on architects. And so I think a lot of clients are looking for architects that are quite established, that they don't want to take the risk. And so younger practices often get overlooked for practices which might have more experience. And that's probably the same to some degree everywhere in the world, but I think there's programs in certain parts of the world where young architects have more platforms to enter. I think there's also parts of the world that are just less litigious. So the idea of something that ends up in a lawsuit isn't the biggest concern, and having someone close by that is an architect to help you work through your project or your design isn't seen as a high-risk thing. It's just seen as getting an expert opinion on a project. And so I think this is one of the biggest hurdles in the States, that you see a lot of young practices that are drawing practices, installation practices, or pavilion practices. And in some ways those practices, and this would also include my own practice to some degree, are trying to articulate a position early in their career, and they're working through what that position means and the modes and mediums by which to reify that position. I think in some parts of the world where you can get commissions much younger, you can work through your thoughts and ideas through the built form proper, and there might be less emphasis on developing a position, but you have projects that you're more heuristically learning from, what interests you and what you see as your statement on the world. Teaching was something I did want to do, but I guess when I started teaching, it was a little accidental. I didn't imagine myself teaching at so early in my career. I think when I graduated from MIT, I started teaching 4 months later, and I think I envisioned myself teaching one day, but probably after 5 years, 10 years in practice before getting into teaching. And at the time, there was an opportunity that opened up. I was kind of juggling between working on some interesting competitions, but they didn't pay well, and you're kind of pulling together different threads of your life to do all the things that you're interested in, which isn't so different than today. And kind of got into teaching very early on, and have more or less been teaching consistently since then. And the thing that I really right off the bat, drew me into teaching beyond the kind of conversations with students and the discourse that arises out of that was just seeing how different minds work through a problem. And it really opens up and makes you elastic to the complexity of design, the creative process, and how non-linear the design process is. And I think just trying to empathize with your students and understand their ways of working through a design problem, which might be very different than the way you would work through a design problem, and just how their mind might process that design problem, opens you up and just makes you a stronger designer to make more elastic your own creative process. I think, looking to the past, and it's something that I would say, I still think about a lot, and I wouldn't say I've answered this problem. I think it's an ongoing problem. I think one of the most difficult things for an architect to do is to delineate where to exert control in the design process and where to allow for openness for things we can't anticipate. And I say this because I think we live in a world right now which is evolving very quickly. We live in a world with very volatile politics and economics, with a rapidly transforming ecological state. And the act of thinking that anything we draw that is going to remain for the next 30, 40, 50, 70 years is going to perform the same way that we drew it today. It's pretty hard to conceive of that, and that automatically opens up a question of what do we do as designers? That idea between where the world is right now and where it's going, and the inability to see that future, it's probably always been there. I think the difference today is that we may have a better ability to understand that those visions of the future will not come true. Whereas I think in previous time periods, there was maybe a more stable vision of what the future held. And our version of that is very unstable. And we see that because, of course, now when we look back to even films from 10 or 15 years ago, they seem archaic, and the relationship between everyday objects, technology, and a lifestyle. So we see that rapid transformation in our recent history, which makes us aware that 10, 15, 30, 50 years from now, we have no idea. And I think this produces a disciplinary crisis to some degree. How do you draw lines on a paper and stand behind those lines and feel that they're things that are going to persist, knowing that those lines that might organize life, that the life that they organize will completely and radically be different. And this is a really tough thing. And for me, it really comes down to, as a designer, where do you exert control and where do you allow for openness? And because you can't control everything. And yet, if you leave everything open as a designer, and as an architect in particular, you're not really answering the call to your discipline, and you're not answering the call to a client, because clients are looking at you to make decisions on their behalf. And at some point, that line that you draw turns into a material line. It has a thickness, it has a precision, it has a materiality. And so there is that disciplinary need to define that line. Everything can't be open-ended. If it was, we wouldn't need to be here, right? And so there's always that balance that we need to find. It's something that I think about a lot. It's something that also in my teaching I work with students a lot on, is trying to understand where in this design proposal should you as an architect really take charge, set up very precise relationships? Where can you be much more open-ended and step back and let things happen? You might anticipate some of those scenarios of how they might happen, but there might be other ones that you can't anticipate. And are you okay with that? Can you actually relinquish some level of control? So I think this is something, that I'm still working through. In terms of things, future challenges that I see, on a personal level, I think, in some ways, the first 5 years in my office have been much more speculative practice and research-based practice and developing a position. And we recently published our first monograph with Actar Publishers and CCA Architecture books that in some ways encapsulated, I think it was maybe about 19 projects and kind of a series of strains of interests through those projects. I think looking forward, the next chapter is translating ideas into the real world and turning these into building practice and getting feedback from that building practice. One of the things in the history of urbanism and architecture to some degree has been assumptions. We make assumptions about if we build this building, people will act like this, or it will perform like this and change people's lives in these ways. These are the things we often draw in our renderings. We build these buildings, we take photos of these buildings, but we rarely go back to see if they worked like that and to learn from that process itself, which would be a humbling experience, but it's probably our best form of feedback to, push back on these assumptions and to, in some ways more precisely understand the relationship between what we do as a discipline and how people use spaces around them. So this is something for me that is a challenge, because I think the biggest challenge isn't that process. The biggest challenge is moving from a speculative research-based practice to built work so that we can gain that next level of feedback on the speculations we're making and to kind of really test these things and see them as experiments, see them as things to learn from, grow from, and develop more built work that, again, does the same thing.